Okay, thank you for the opportunity to speak. So just want to start off by saying I'm no expert in generative artificial intelligence, which is a really strange way to start a talk with that particular title. So what I mean by that is I don't know a lot about the technology, you know, the machine learning parts behind it, but I guess I'm a very interested academic and been following the debate closely. And for my sins, I'm the institutional lead at the University of Derby in our response to generative artificial intelligence. And I chose my title slide very carefully with the Terminator robot on the front, because some of the kind of media rhetoric and the panic is akin to the Terminator films, that this is the beginning of the end of the universities, the world as we know it. So I really wanted to start off by just telling you something which may be fairly obvious to you, that artificial intelligence has been around for a long time. You know, if you look at your research activities or the research activities of your peers, things like, you know, recognizing speech, language processing, object recognition, image classification are all artificial intelligence-driven techniques and tools that we use routinely. If we look at the world outside of higher education, which is often a few skips and steps ahead of what happens in higher education, artificial intelligence is a big part of our life. You've only got to look at, you know, recommendation systems on very popular platforms like YouTube, Netflix, Amazon, Spotify, to the virtual assistants that help us run our lives like Siri or Google Assistant or Alexa. You know, these are all artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence is elsewhere in the world as well, you know, from fraud detection in finance, predictive modelling, healthcare and finance, etc., etc. Artificial intelligence is everywhere. Might not argue that artificial intelligence has also been in higher education for some time. You know, so perhaps the most obvious example that most of us would be familiar with would be a tool like Grammarly, which at least initially was predominantly by students who have special considerations. You know, not only does it correct spelling, punctuation and grammar, you know, it gives advice on clarity and engagement, on tone, you know, in your academic writing. And I do remember the debates that this was amount to cheating when this tool first became available. But, you know, there's loads of other uses, you know, adaptive learning systems, using AI to identify trends and pattern in assessment scores. You know, some universities have toyed around with the idea of using chatbots or virtual assistants that are on web landing pages, or even to, you know, triage students before they get additional support. So artificial intelligence has been around in HE, you know, for some time. But really the reason I'm here today is because of this particular tool, which is called ChatGPT, and it's taken me forever to learn it's not ChatGTP, which is being a biologist is a sin. So just in case you weren't aware, ChatGPT stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer Model, and this is my non-expert bit. I mean, but generative means it comes up with a coherent, human-like response in response to the prompt that you give it. And there's a lot of skill in that prompt, which is maybe something we'll touch on in questions. It's pre-trained, so the model is based on a pre-trained database, and ChatGPT-3 was trained on a fixed, sort of 16 gigabyte, 300 million word database. But the new large language model, ChatGPT-4, is actually based on, you know, something much larger and human informed. And it's a transform model which responds to, you know, how it understands context, how it finds new answers to things. So ChatGPT has got all of the kind of press, you know, and I'm sure many of you have had a play on it. And if you haven't, and if you do nothing else after my talk, then go and have a go on it, you know, just, you know, to see what it's capable of. Perhaps something that's particularly relevant to our sector is that Microsoft have announced a tool called Copilot, which embeds this technology into its Microsoft packages, including Microsoft Word. So if you're thinking this thing might go away or not be visible to students, that ain't going to happen. There are so many tools that every time I do this talk, I'm having to go and see what new generative AI tools are out there. I mean, someone's going to ask me a question, but yeah, ChatGPT, it's really rubbish at referencing. It doesn't write properly. You should have a go at ChatGPT-4, which I did on the way down, and see the difference. And you should have a go at a couple of these tools. I'm conscious of time, so I won't go through two of them, but I want to mention a few of these that you may have not played with before. So Jenny. So Jenny first of all, Jenny's a paid-for service, so there is an equity of experience question that could come up here about how students access some of these tools. But Jenny, as you start writing on a Word kind of document, it searches its database for you and recommends references. So if I wrote a statement like, I think the VARC learning model has been, the VARC learning model has been debunked, it will say, how about these 6 references here? This one says, this one says, this one says, would you like me to cite them for you in your text? So it searches the corpus of literature and makes recommendations about what sources that you should put in there, providing a sort of mini summary. Consensus is a really interesting one, and one I personally like. It's designed particularly for searching, the deep web content, the peer-reviewed sources, government reports. You search a research question, and by research question I'm meaning, proper, academic level hypothesis questions, and it gives you a big list of all the papers that address that question, but summarises them for you, highlighting the relevant sections of the paper. It also tells you things like how many people have cited it, but not just how many, where they've cited in their text. Was it part of their background information? Was it part of their critique? Did they agree in sentiment with the original argument or not? So you can obviously see some of the alarms there. Chat PDF. I'm sure many of us have talked to a PDF of a paper before, but this time it will answer back to you. You upload a PDF of a paper and you ask it questions like, what were the author's main critiques? What were the controls used in this paper? And it will search the paper and answer the question for you. Perhaps just one more, which I particularly like, is GLASP. It's paid for, again, sadly. But what you do is when you're looking through a big, copious Word document, think maybe a policy document from university, you highlight sections as you go through, the key bits, and it pulls all those things together, but then will summarise them for you into a coherent section. And you've maybe seen some of the Google tools where it can summarise email trails. So when you come back from annual leave and you've got that awful 22 email train, it summarised the main arguments for you, into one single kind of coherent sentence. That sounds really cool. So there's so many tools, is what I'm trying to say. There may be others you've tried. Don't forget Google Bard, the equivalent, which earlier reports suggest it may be even more efficient than ChatGPT with the language model 4. I haven't been able to get onto it yet, unfortunately. So why do we care? My tone was perhaps quite positive about some of the things we could do. We care because some of these kind of headlines, and there's so many of them now, I could find lots. Essentially, these tools are purported to be able to create a content which is unique every time. If I asked it the question, please discuss the advantages and disadvantages of the VARC learning model, 10 times I'll get 10 different answers, and each of those 10 answers would be unique, truly unique. They're not copied from anywhere, they're a composite of the intelligence. And obviously that creates massive concerns about academic integrity, about how on earth do we ensure that work is their own. You've seen some headlines like this about passing exams, etc., etc. If you go on to ChatGPT-4, still nearly getting it wrong, its efficiency improved massively. So ChatGPT-3 on the Biology Olympiad exam, it was in the 30th percentile, now it's in the 99th percentile in terms of passing those exams. So if you had a go at it a long time ago and thought it's rubbish with references, it's getting a lot better. I just want to say very quickly that a lot of the focus has been on written, and ChatGPT-4 can write song, it can write code. If you say, can you write me a sonnet in the style of Shakespeare on Donald Trump's election campaign, it will do so, and it's pretty good. There are ones that do images as well. DALL-E 2 is really good. If you say, can you give me a picture of Donald Trump riding a unicorn in the style of Picasso, well, actually, it won't do that because it doesn't let you do famous people. But if you put an academic running a unicorn to Picasso, it will do it for you, and it's a unique picture. There's some interesting questions about intellectual property rights amongst these things as well. But perhaps we're more interested in what the sector are doing, about this particular issue. I guess the first kind of reaction was all about, stop it, we've got to detect this, we're going to throw some restrictions, on its use, we're going to block it. And I have seen some talk in certain countries and schools groups that they're trying to stop this. I mean, that sounds completely futile, it has to be said. and racking up punishment for those caught using this particular technique. I mean, I personally think all of these things are, not a waste of time. I recognise the value in having deterrence present, but you're entering into a very dangerous arms race where the other side have got much more will, money and capacity. So as soon as we come up with a detection tool, we'll be outstripped. It's worth noting that Turner in UK, which many HEIs use, have developed a detection tool which they were going to roll out across all of their service providers, I believe, in April, but they've changed their mind and let people opt in or opt out. I think most people have decided to opt out in the interim until the tool can be tested. But in terms of sector response, so I'm drawn on three things: the QAA response, the Department of Education, and I'm a member of the GISC group from the National Centre of Artificial Intelligence. I obviously also know what my own institution's done and where people have kindly shared their kind of thoughts or words from what their institutional practice is. I've had a look there. And I've grouped them into kind of two areas. The first one is about preserving the integrity of current and future assessment. It's my personal view that we don't call this use of generative AI cheating. We just recognise it as another tool that's available to our students. That's not to say 100% use of a generative artificial intelligence piece of software, cut and paste, isn't cheating. Clearly that is. But trying to prohibit the use of these kind of tools is futile. Someone made the link into Wikipedia. You mustn't use Wikipedia in your work. Don't use Wikipedia. It's really bad for you. What do? The first time we're interested in the topic, we go to Wikipedia to take a look. Yeah, it's a catalyst. So the sector response seems to be divided into these kind of areas. So just to give you a few examples. So first of all, communication with students, making sure that, we tell students about the capabilities, but also the limitations of these AI tools, such as how they use citations. There's a lot of questions about implicit bias in the databases that they use. Think about Western canons of knowledge, particularly, which is a real interest. But also training students in how to use the prompts. There's some really good work out there about how to successfully use and design these particular prompts. There is some work about changing policies and practice and student declarations. So, our own institution is, like many, going to change academic regulations. And we haven't got the wording right, but it will say in normal English something like, if you completely use AI to do your work, that is cheating, in academic language, because it's not recognised, formally in our regulations. That's the same for many. And student declarations, as they submit work, will be updated to reflect that. But the real kind of powerful thing, I think, is going to be around assessment design. I noticed with interest that David at the beginning talked about authentic assessment, and that's where most of the focus is going. How we give context-driven, genuine assessment that applies to local context, national context, stakeholder context. It's never going to beat the generative AI, but it makes it more challenging for a student in order to be able to use the tool quickly and easily. So that's where a lot of the focus is. The focus has also gone on particular assessment modalities. Naturally, a lot of focus has gone on the essay. So a topic that's well talked about in the literature, of several thousand words, it's hard to see how that type of assessment will stay the course of time in its current guise. From a bioscience perspective, which is my background, I guess some of the concerns are around the background context to the very common form of assessments like laboratory reports, but lots of questions particularly about the capstone experience, particularly those which aren't lab-based, so, the kind of meta-analyses types, but even those that are lab-based, the background context, interpretation and results, especially given some of the tools where you can upload your own information and ask it to critique and summarise and find relevant literature. And given the weighting of the capstone experience, that's perhaps a particular concern of interest. So that's the first kind of trunk of work. The second focus of the sector is all about academic integrity, which is not a new thing, obviously, But it's about really upping what you do in a student-facing sense regarding academic integrity, emphasising to students the value of learning. I mean, a good example would be you can get ChatGPT to write code which would pass level 4 and 5 maths assessments, my colleagues have shown me, very, very, very well. However, if there's a problem with that code and you're asked to challenge, asked to correct it, if you haven't got the underlying learning and principles, then obviously in a workplace you're in real trouble. So that's perhaps the best example of emphasising the importance of understanding the principles behind. Also, doubling down on the transferable employability skills, embedding things like the value of integrity, and trustworthiness and those kind of skills that they're valued. But also being open and honest and create networks of support. I think kind of the initial sector response of kind of hiding behind a rock and see what happens first is not good enough. And in our institution, we're being upfront with the students, the union students, creating some web resources, talking about these tools, showing what they can and can't do, and just bringing them up into open dialogue. It's only by doing so we're beginning to understand. There's a lot of waiting around, though, in the sector at the moment. I haven't seen a lot of proactive action. A lot of people waiting to see what happens and waiting for something, to land on their laps in terms of support. I really wanted to talk about the opportunities of these. I mean, the discourse has been quite negative in general, I feel. A lot of panic and fear, which is only natural. But I've seen some really powerful uses. I mean, I've started to use it in my teaching already. I mean, it's great for, when you're doing things like discussing a topic and looking for definitions and those kind of things. Let's see what the artificial intelligence says. I mean, these tools rely on prompts, but most humans do as well. I mean, if you ask somebody to write something, they stare looking blankly, got no ideas. You put something in front of them and say, what do you think? Well, suddenly out comes the critique, and it's great for that particular tool. I've already used it to help me write some abstract for conferences, don't worry. But, we've all had to write the same thing 100 times. Imagine you're writing something for the Royal Society of Biology. What does the Royal Society of Biology do? People who work here have probably written that 1,000 times, thinking, how on earth can I say that differently? Well, ask ChatGPT. It gives you an answer. Obviously, don't copy it, but it gives you a new way of thinking about it and composing things. And there's some really cool ways that, these tools are being able to help. I mean, there's actually a kind of growing census of voices that actually this could really help the academic staff at HEs by taking away some of the what they class as bureaucratic and mundane kind of activities, and actually relieve them up to be more human again. So it allows us to do the more human things, the research and the critical thinking, by taking away the kind of more mundane tasks. And by that I mean AI's role in marking, for example. I've seen one really powerful one where if you ask, you can set some parameters and ask it to write 200 different versions of the same feedback on certain key areas which are flagged in a database, and it does it for you like a click of a finger. So not well formed yet, but some interesting ideas. So that's my brief summary of where the sector is. Here's some of my sources. And I'm really interested to hear what other institutions are doing, have a bit of discussion about generative artificial intelligence.
So who wants to go first? Not everybody at once. Okay, go.
Hi, so I'm Chris from the University of Birmingham. So during the pandemic, I guess many of us really went to open book exams, and that was great. I think you talked about authentic assessment. And let's think of our graduates when they're going to workplaces. When do we ever stick them in a room with no devices and ask them to regurgitate stuff and to develop solutions to things without any associated devices? So I'm all for authentic assessment. I'm all for open book. But with ChatGPT, do you envisage that there's a possibility that institutions are going to revert back to doing more closed book assessments? Which I think would be a retrograde step, by the way.
Well, I agree it would be a retrograde step unless there's a pedagogic justification. But unfortunately, I've seen it in my own institution already. The fear that students could cheat has forced people back into the room, particularly for those kind of examinations where the answers are definitive. I'm thinking like business, engineering equations, and those kind of things. Yeah, so I have seen that shift back already, the talk that we have to go back to that, which is a real shame. The open book examination is a really interesting one because that form of assessment mode particularly at post-92, like where I'm from, was very popular in the pandemic and has raised, but that's got particular challenges, and it takes a real skill to design questions. No question is ungoogable, for want of a better word, but it takes real skill to one which is challenging to be ungoogable. And I do have some thoughts and some resources on that. Happy to talk to you about that when we have time over the break.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, really interesting. I heard about this in November, ChatGPT, and I ran an essay through, and it got about 50%. Then in January exams, on the day of the exam, I put my question through just to see, and I think it would have got about 60. And I had colleagues put his MCQ questions through, and it got 100%. So there is a panic, and I actually see why there is a panic. But if we get through that period, I wonder your thoughts. Do you think the university should take a step back and ask the sector, the work in the real world, what expectation will the next round of workers have, for what they will use AI in their jobs that we as universities can then prepare students for?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you talked about the improvement. I mean, one thing I didn't mention, that there's several tools that rephrase the work produced by these ChatGPT and others. So the detection tools which look for the output, they then paraphrase them into a more human tone of voice, which makes it even harder to detect. I mean, absolutely an answer to your question. But I think the worst thing that could happen is to leave it to individual academics to make individual choices about what they're doing. I mean, that's always risky, which is why our institution, I'm sure most have as well, are formed a working group or something similar to try and think about how we deal with this particular issue.